Pastor Matt.
And I'm Mary Rose.
And welcome back to our podcast, Reading Through Scripture. We are in Exodus chapter 32, and we are getting into one of the big incidents that, in my mind, this story of the golden calf that we're going to read today, I always kind of picture that scene from the Charlton Heston movie, right? The Ten Commandments, and there. Do you remember that scene? Oh, okay. When I view it in my head, I still see that because obviously we just have the words. We don't have...
I didn't realize that movie went all the way up through the golden calf.
I'm pretty sure it does because he comes down and he smashes him, doesn't he?
I don't remember any of that. But sure. It's called the Ten Commandments, right?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure he goes up and brings him down at the end. I think it shortchanges the whole end and makes it, a pretty quick wrap up. But yeah, I think it does.
Huh. I don't even remember that. I just remember Pharaoh.
It's been a long time, I'm sure, since we've watched that. It used to be on network TV around...
Easter, right?
Around Easter, always around Passover.
Like Good Friday or something?
Yeah, Passover, right? Because that's the Passover story.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, that's a whole side note. But we are in Exodus 32, and why don't you read 1 to 6 to start?
When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol, cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day, the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry.
We got to remember when, I think it's back in Exodus, I can't remember what chapter it is right now. We talked about it earlier in the podcast, but what was the sight they had, the last sight they had of Moses?
Him going up into the mountain.
And while it's trembling, right, and they're terrified, and it looks like the mountain's about to explode.
Right.
And so you can understand why they're saying, as for this Moses, who knows, right? And how long is Moses up there? It's about 40 days. So that's a long time to have someone go up into this cloud, into this pillar of fire on the top of the mountain, and go, well, I guess he's not coming back. Mm-hmm. So at least to put the best construction on what they're thinking, this is kind of what's happening, right? They've had this scene where they see Moses go up and they don't think he's going to come back down. They think he's dead and gone at this point. And it's interesting that while this covenant has just been given, right, about they've heard some of these commands, and Moses now gone up to talk with God and get the plans for the tabernacle and get the inscribed tablets, but they've heard the commandments. How long did it take them then to break them?
Not long.
Not long at all, right? Almost immediately after they hear and they have had this rescue, had this promise, and remember, the last thing they said before this, last thing the people have said before this, is all that the Lord has said we will do. Mm-hmm. The next thing is, make us idols, or make us something else to worship, right? Mm-hmm. And so it devolves really quickly into idolatry for them. They turn back to something else. I think there's a reason, I think, why these three chapters, Exodus 32, 33, and 34, interrupt the story. Because you have the instructions for the tabernacle that we just got through. And we'll see after chapter 34, 35 through 40 are almost identical of them carrying out the building of the tabernacle. And so in between, while they're in the waiting, trying to figure out how to worship the Lord, we have them not being patient for the way that the Lord is going to instruct them to do it, how he's going to have them build it, and they're trying to create a shortcut. So if you compare this section of the tabernacle preparations and the instructions with the creation of the golden calf, We have, for the tabernacle, it's God's initiative, right? He's commanding them, right? What to do and how to do it. And here, they say, Aaron, build something for us. We need something to worship. Give us whatever it is that'll focus our worship. In the tabernacle, there's a willing offering requested. Whoever cares about the Lord, give these supplies. And right, they get this abundance of materials.
There's also the required amount, though.
A little bit, yes. But here, Aaron commands the gold to be given. The gold wasn't commanded, it was a shekel, right, to provide for those things. For the tabernacle, it seems like, probably as it seemed for you listening, painstaking preparations for the tabernacle, all these instructions. Here, there's no planning. It happens hasty, and the next day we'll do this thing. You have a lengthy building process afterwards, which will be in the second half. But all this stuff taken for how long to construct it and how to do it, and it takes a lot of time. Here, it's all made quickly and hastily. They throw it in, and out comes this calf, as Aaron will later say. There's a safeguarding of divine holiness, right? We talked about the Holy of Holies, the holy place, the courtyard, and all those things of how you can get to different areas. There's no safeguards. It's immediate accessibility to this idol. There's an invisible God in the tabernacle, right, above the mercy seat, but you don't see God's presence, aside from like the cloud, but you don't really see his presence. And here, they want a visible manifestation of God.
Sure.
They want something they can see and locate. And in the tabernacle, it's a personal and active God, someone who's going to go with them, who's going to give them commands, who's going to walk with them, to now an impersonal object. So it's almost like they're trying to shortchange everything. And so I think we see that they're trying to find a way to have mediated what God promised he was going to give over time, and through a particular way, through something that's hasty and short-sighted.
I guess I don't really understand. I don't really understand any of this, if I'm being honest.
Like what I'm saying, or this whole scene?
No. I get the comparisons that you're making, but like I feel like we need to just like hold up and just back up, because these are the same people who, like, God led them with a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. Like, these people walked across the Red Sea. These people were given manna every morning, and quail, and water from the rock. Like, and all that happened was Moses was gone for 40 days. And it's not like he's gone for 40 days and like, oh, they start to wonder or have doubts. It's they immediately go to like, build us a God. Like, I don't get that.
So here's what I think is key. I think it's not so much that they want a different God, as much as they're trying to now find a way to mediate and control God. Because, and I was going to get to this, but this is a good place to bring it up. What does it say in verse 6?
Well, it says in verse 5 that they're going to do a festival to the Lord.
Right. And so all throughout, what was the purpose of Israel's leaving Egypt initially? What was the reason that Moses gave to Pharaoh?
So that they could go and make their sacrifices to God.
And worship Yahweh. And that hasn't happened yet. This is the first real festival. It's supposed to be a Passover. And they haven't celebrated one yet. So you have that. And then they're raising up the next day and they're offering, yours said something different, but it's the other term for it, but burnt offerings and peace offerings. I can't remember what yours called, the peace offerings.
Burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings.
Fellowship offerings. So we talked about that when the elders went up in chapter 24, right? They had that fellowship with God, that intimacy of relationship. So their whole thought here is that Moses has kind of been functioning as the mediator between them and God.
Sure.
And Moses is gone, so we need something else now to mediate that relationship between us and God.
But like, they obviously felt like Aaron was some kind of mediator because they went to Aaron.
Sure.
And Aaron's an idiot.
Well, again, to put it graciously, in in verse 1, it can be read not as they gathered around Aaron, which is what it says, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It could be they gathered against Aaron. The preposition in Hebrew can mean a hostile group, so kind of threatening Aaron into compliance. I don't know how much I would want to read into that, because he makes excuses later, and he doesn't say, well, they threatened me and so I did this. He just says I threw it in. So, I don't know, but maybe he felt the pressure. But yeah, Aaron certainly does not hold up what he should here.
Like, and why does he outright lie? Like, why does he say, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt? He's the priest.
Well, and so I think part of the problem is this is the same way that kind of the Egyptians functioned. They thought those images were a way to mediate that presence. So you offer up to this visible thing, this sign, that then is a way to connect with God. But God has already told them that they shouldn't do that, right? That there's supposed to be no image made of him. So there's no excuse either way.
They already have the ark.
The ark hasn't been made yet.
Oh, it hasn't?
No.
Oh.
No, we just have the instructions for construction of the ark given on the mountain, or brought down to them, but they haven't received it yet. Like, that's something that Aholiab and Bezalel are going to construct. So they don't have that yet. All they have had so far is really Moses and his direct presence with God, and Aaron as the mouthpiece. Which, again, doesn't negate the fact that they were already commanded, and that it has been explicitly said not to make an image. But I think what's happening here, while it is idolatry, I think the best terminology I think I can use for this is they're doing what we would call syncretistic worship.
I don't know what that means.
So that's a term where we talk about how when you bring practices from multiple religions together, and so you say it's like hedging your bets.
Oh.
So you bring it, you're like, well, okay, I worship Jesus, he's the only way, but I'm also going to just do some stuff for Buddha in case. And so they're kind of saying, well, this is what God has said, and yeah, we want to do the things to honor God because he brought us out, but what we know is the Egyptian practice. So we're going to bring the Egyptian practices in here, and we're going to combine them in some ways. And so they're bringing in some other things that are not true worship and not right into the worship of Yahweh. And it seems like, as we hear from their response, from God's response, and from the way it's responded to later, that God does not take kindly to that, the things that tend to conceal and confuse who he really is. And I think, syncretism, I think, is that's a word that we use all the time, and at least in the Lutheran circles and in the theological world, because it's so easy to tie these things together and to bring other stuff in that we don't always realize is leading us astray or leading to false worship. And so we think we're being faithful while we're being led astray by practices that aren't necessarily faithful. And so, some examples of this is saying it's okay to pray with people of any faith because we're all praying to God. But we would say, actually, that's not right, because you're saying that directing a prayer to anyone actually makes it to God, or actually is to the right God. And we would say, as LCMS Lutherans, actually, we probably shouldn't pray with a Muslim. At least not, do a prayer to the triune God and then say a prayer to Allah for us. We wouldn't advocate for that. And we wouldn't do a service where we're praying side by side, typically.
Right. Well, and I mean, I think it's not... Well, actually, maybe I'm not sure when it comes to Muslims, but I feel like in a lot of other religions, they don't make that claim that, there is only one God. Like Christianity would say, there aren't any other gods.
Right.
There is not gods in all the other religions.
Right.
That's a complete lie that people made up.
Whereas
those other religions, they might even say that Yahweh is a god.
They might be, well, actually, I shouldn't speak for Muslims. I don't know if they would be, how okay they would be with that. And it's the same thing with, Jews would not, because we're the three essentially monotheistic religions in the world. But the others would say, oh yeah, sure, whatever, add it to the pantheon, right? It doesn't matter.
Right.
Which is why why it was easy for the Roman colonies and the Roman leadership back in the days of like Caesar and Augustus and like all those people back then to conquer these lands and say, oh yeah, worship your gods alongside ours. It's fine. Keep your practices. It doesn't matter as long as you pay taxes and still honor our gods as well. But that was why the Jews were always a problem, and later why the Christians were a problem. Because we said that wasn't okay.
Right.
And I think C.S. Lewis brings this to a point later in, I think it's in The Four Loves, but I might have that wrong for which book it is, when he's talking about, in particular, like, love for your country. How that can become an idol. How it's you can still be a good Christian and profess love and love for Christ, but you can also place your country or a leader alongside, or an ideology alongside, that isn't actually Christian anymore. And so you end up with this, you claim to be Christian and they're not really outrightly hostile to each other. They kind of sort of blend together, but you have to jettison some things of Christianity or some things of what is said about God, and that becomes problematic. Right? I mean, we saw that in World War II with Hitler. He claimed Christians can do the things they want to do, but he started saying things like, well, turning the other cheek is weakness, and you don't love your enemy, which you can't say that's also true and live by that ideology and say you're Christian anymore. At least you can't say you're following Jesus anymore if you're doing that, which is where the problems come. We begin to take these national ideologies and put them into this sphere where they're co-equal. But as Jesus says, he's saying it about money, but you can't love two things. In the end, you'll love one and hate the other. And so, like, you can't have two masters. Eventually, you'll jettison the one, even if you still claim it in name. You won't actually be following it anymore.
Right.
And we saw that happen with ancient Israel, right? The kings who said they were still following Yahweh, but didn't care about love and mercy and justice or the neighbor and didn't seek God anymore. They said they were still doing that, but all their practices no longer displayed that. And so what does God end up saying? I loathe your offerings. I loathe your worship. None of it pleases me anymore. And I think that ought to be a really deep gut check to all of us of what we're prioritizing.
Right. Because it comes down to, like, what's going to take precedence when the rubber meets the road.
Yep.
Because inevitably, all the things that you give some allegiance to will get to a point where it asks more than it ought. And I mean, even like our callings and vocations, we can put in the wrong order.
Yep.
And something that is good and something created by God can become an idol.
Absolutely. And I think this is where C.S. Lewis is really wise in that section of The Four Loves. I'm fairly certain that's where it is, where he talks about how, like, taking joy in your country, loving the land, loving the freedoms you've been given, praying for the leader is good and right and true, but it becomes an idol when you think it's better than everyone else, or when you think you're more deserving than other people, or it causes you to look down on others, or to treat others with hatred. And that's when it becomes a problem. And in some ways, I think we're seeing that from both sides of the political world in our nation right now. That it may not be prioritizing the nation as much as a political ideology. And I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I just saw there was a two-part essay published posthumously. I think that's the right word, right? Posthumously. By Tim Keller, criticizing essentially all the political parties that he wrote, like, right around the time he died, and he hadn't, like, proofread it again, so it wasn't published, but it got published just in the last couple of weeks.
Oh, interesting.
And so I'm excited to read it. I haven't had a chance yet. I just came across it like 2 days ago. Because he was pretty astute and wise about recognizing those things. So it'll just be interesting to see. But circling back, I think that they're falling into this problem of thinking they can worship Yahweh however they want, instead of letting Yahweh or God define how he's to be worshipped and what it really looks like. And I do want to say something else about verse 1. We had talked about before how Elohim, it usually goes like the singular verb and then the plural noun or whatever it is, right? We talked about that.
I don't know. I don't know what Elohim is.
That's a word for God. Oh. We talked about how there's this unusual thing when it comes to the Hebrew that when it speaks about God, it always speaks about him in the plural.
Oh, okay.
And so it's just interesting here that rule sort of functions, but they both were in the plural. So it's like they're saying they're making multiple gods.
What are you talking about?
The Elohim, let us make gods for us. The who, plural, shall go before us in verse 1. So make us gods, plural, who, plural, shall go before us. And usually it would go, make us gods, plural, who, singular, shall go before us. So is God acting as one? That was kind of the thing we were talking about the other week. So anyways, it just hints at this being multiple gods they're making, or false gods.
Oh. Side
note, but I was reading another, what was the guy's name? Was it theologian Robert Capon, I think is who it was. But he put it this way, when he was asked about talking about how sometimes we think that people aren't religious enough, but it's in fact that we're too religious. We're looking for things everywhere. In some sense, we like to think that we're not a religious society, but we tend to make the wrong things into religious things. And this is what he said. The world is by no means averse to religion. In fact, it is devoted to it with a passion. It will buy any recipe for salvation, as long as that formula leaves the responsibility for cooking up salvation firmly in human hands. The world is drowning in religion, but it is scared out of its wits by any mention of the gospel of grace. Which, man, hearing that sentence, I'm like, amen, brother, amen. Right? So they're looking for any way to try and connect to God, but often I think our world looks for ways to connect to God that are not the ways he designed, which is the problem. They're looking to connect and find that way to God through their works or through religious experience or through knowledge, and they won't look to God for where he's promised to be found. In the Old Testament, that's in the tabernacle and in the ways that he's promised to mediate his presence. For us today, that would be in word and sacrament, where God has promised to be. Now, he can meet us outside of those things to be sure, but he has promised that he will be for us in them. But I think, so to put that in modern context, when we think about the fact that we're too religious, we have a religion of things like parenting, religion of exercise, religion of marriage, religion of work, whatever it is, like you were talking about, those vocations that we put too highly. So people are turning to those things in order to have some kind of deeper meaning in life that they're looking to apart from God. Something that they say they can understand themselves by, that they can live for, something that they can get some sort of meaningful reason for their existence from. And I talk about that all the time in marriage or premarital counseling. That you can't make your spouse or your kids into that thing because it's not something they were meant to bear. It will kill and crush that relationship. And how many divorces don't you see where as soon as the kids leave, the marriage falls apart because everything has been centered on the kids. They essentially turn the kid into an idol and sacrifice their marriage on the altar of their kid. And as we joke, the goal of parenthood is that the kids leave, not the spouse. Right? We want them to go out and be prosperous on their own, find their own way to live, and not be attached to one single parent. But so often we get that mixed up. And I think I already mentioned it, but the last words that Israel had spoken was them saying in chapter 24, all that the Lord has commanded us, we will do. And now they're obviously not doing that.
Right.
And so kind of, again, going back to that syncretism and what's really happening here, I think Israel is kind of trying to fashion a new false religion, but after the pattern of what God had already shown them. Right? That's what we kind of got in verse 5 and 6. They're trying to do it, but by their own ways. And Aaron builds the altar there in verse 5 and says that there will be a festival to the Lord, Aha La Yahweh, the next day. So again, they think they're worshiping Yahweh through this. That's the Hebrews. They're doing a festival to the Lord. In their minds, it would be in all caps. I don't think it is in all caps here.
It is.
Oh, it is. Okay. So it notes that it is the word Yahweh. And so throughout Exodus, we read the refrain that Israel was supposed to leave to hold this festival to the Lord, but now they're turning it into something other than a festival, actually to the Lord. And then in verse 6, rise up and play. There's a lot of speculation about what exactly that means, and it can mean a lot of different things.
I don't have that, so where is that?
What does the end of verse 6 say? Revelry, I think, was yours, right?
Yes, got up to indulge in revelry.
In revelry. So rise up and play is kind of the more literal.
Oh.
And so it could imply illicit and immoral sexual activity, which normally accompanied the fertility rites around the Canaanite gods' worship of Baal and often some of the Egyptian gods.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that. But it means kind of joy and laughter. So it looks like a good time. This is the same word actually here used for Isaac's name, meaning either laughter or caress. So it may be that, but we don't know for sure. So some people have tried to say that's exactly what it is, and I think there's good reason to believe that it's sexual immorality, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. And again, they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And so it's kind of this ironic twist on Israel's sin. So earlier, at the bottom of the mountain, they offered these things up to consecrate themselves to Yahweh. They offered up peace offerings and burnt offerings when they were making the covenant to set themselves apart as holy to the Lord, following Exodus chapter 19, where they were called out to be a holy nation and a royal priesthood.
I thought you said they hadn't made any sacrifices yet.
They haven't had the feast to the Lord, the Passover.
Oh.
They haven't had that yet. But they did make those sacrifices at the ratifying of the covenant. So after Exodus 19 and then the giving the Ten Commandments, they offer up these things. And that was to set themselves apart and make themselves holy, right? For God's purposes. And so now kind of this act itself perverts their worship and, in a sense, repudiates their calling. It takes away and removes their calling and set apart as God's holy people who worship him and honor his name. So they've kind of reverted themselves from holy to common. And while what is common can be made holy, there is no process in any of the scriptures for what is holy to be made common. As we've already seen with food, whatever's holy that is removed has to be destroyed. It had to be burnt completely. So we're seeing a problem that's about to come up. If they've changed themselves from holy to common, what should happen to them?
Die.
They should be destroyed. And we'll see that this leads into what's coming. But you want to pick it up at verse 7.
Continuing in verse 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. "Lord," he said, "why should your anger burn against your people whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, 'I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever.' Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened."
So notice first what God says in verse 7. Is there anything that strikes you in there?
Well, he says that Moses brought them out of Egypt.
And they're Moses' people. That certainly is not a good sign.
That's
right?
like the dad saying, "Well, he's your son."
Yeah.
Like
it's throwing the blame somewhat on Moses, but also like a repudiation of his own relationship to them.
Yeah.
Right? So it's almost denying that. And in verse 7, it's often, what does it say? Corrupted, is that what you were saying? They've corrupted themselves?
Yes.
So the Hebrew word sihet, is actually the idea of like going to ruin. It's often translated as corrupted, which is kind of similar. But that it's the same word used in Genesis 6:12, which is to describe the corruption or the ruin of the world in Noah's day. And if you remember, a larger part of that description is that all the inclinations of men's hearts are only evil all the time. That's the description of the people in Noah's day. So there is nothing good in them. It's kind of what God is saying. Like if you hear this in Hebrew, you hear that word, you go, "Ooh, that ain't good." Right? Like that's a bad sign. This verse 8 then is kind of when the people say that these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, they're rejecting God as a redeemer. They're saying it wasn't really Yahweh in a lot of senses, right? I mean, maybe that's been the worst construction on it because they think they're holding a festival to Yahweh, but God would say they're looking for somebody else to give credit for what I myself have done for them. And so in a sense, they're looking for an idol to represent God's presence with them rather than his actual presence. And so I think it goes this underlying fear. If Moses isn't there and God is up there with his presence in the cloud, is he really present with us? So they're afraid that God won't continue to be present with them if Moses isn't there. I think if I'm trying to put myself in their head, I think that's what they're thinking, right? Because they say, as for Moses, we don't even know what happened to him. So they think they've lost access to God's presence. And so they're seeking welfare or blessing or protection from God on their own terms, or apart from God on their own terms. It's kind of what they're looking for here. They want assurance, right? And they think that they can get that by doing this thing. So none of it is good. And obviously, God is quite angry with them. And then we have this kind of first response speech of Moses as intercessor kind of in this whole section that you read.
Well, hold on. Before that, are we going to talk about the end of verse 10? So, like, he says his anger is going to burn against them and going to destroy them. But then he says, then I will make you into a great nation. What's that mean?
So, the you there is singular. He's going to wipe it all out and start over with Moses. That's the implication of this passage. That he's done with those people because they don't care about him. So he's going to start over with Moses.
I mean, I'm sure we're going to get to it when we get down to verse 14 about the Lord relenting.
Sure.
That is just something really hard for me to understand with like an all-knowing God. How does an all-knowing God change his mind?
Do you want me to jump there now and then go back to the other stuff, or do you want to wait until we get there?
I guess we can wait. I mean, it's kind of connected to this too, because it's about the position he takes with them.
It is.
But he knows how it's all going to go down.
He does in a sense, but I think it also shows in this next section and in the next couple of chapters the importance of the mediator and that role, which I think is kind of the focus of this. Sometimes we lose that, but in chapters 32, 33, and 34, Moses is set up as this key example of a mediator who enables God's compassion to win out.
Okay, I'm assuming you're going to explain that more when we get down to 14.
Well, I'll continue. Yes, but I think as we get through 11 to 14, we'll kind of get what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So Moses, in verse 11 to 14, kind of appeals to God, right? He makes an appeal to God to remember his faithfulness and his promises to Abraham and the people. So he calls back to God to be faithful to his word. Mm-hmm. And when we come to worship, we receive what God does, but we also implore him in prayer to remember his promises. That's what we ask him to do, right? We talked about this with the Lord's Supper. Like, we're asking God to remember us in his mercy and his promises, and to continue in steadfast love for us. Mm-hmm. So the church now, in a sense, functions as Moses, imploring God to remember his promises, asking God to remember his promises to us despite our sinfulness. And I think there are kind of three central points in this whole section that are given about from the divine perspective. So from God's perspective, there's the idolatry of the golden calf. There's Israel being stiff-necked and their refusal to obey and listen to him. So they won't. They're not turning their hearts to him, right, in all of this. And finally, God's desire to have compassion, because that's still there. And so these three things will guide the next, 2.5 chapters. And so if we look at Moses' first petition, this is 11 to 13, it begins with a reminder of Israel's relationship with God. And first of all, recalls that God publicly acted to claim Israel for himself by the plagues, right? Mm-hmm. That God was the one who acted. And Moses says, by calling them your people, which is what Moses, he doesn't say my people, he says your people, right? Moses reminds the Lord that he has already now bound himself to Israel. So, because God said that the nations would know what kind of God he was by what he did with Israel, right? By him bringing them out and delivering them. So if God brings them out and then kills them all, God's compassion and love will not be known. He will be certainly known as an all-powerful God, right? Mm-hmm. He could inflict all that on Egypt, and now on the people of Israel who disobeyed, he smites them. But he can't be revealed as one who's loving and compassionate if he destroys them and starts all over.
So I don't have a problem with that.
Sure.
I have a problem with God needing the wise counsel of Moses.
God doesn't have to save anybody, right?
Right.
So he could entirely reject them. And there's every reason for God to do so here.
Right.
And so I think Moses' point here is that even if you're just in doing this, mm-hmm. what you're actually doing is you're undermining your own appearance, character, and the other people's ability to know you mm-hmm. by doing this.
Right. I understand that. I don't understand why Moses had to say that. God knows everything.
Sure.
God's wisdom is far beyond our wisdom.
Sure.
So I guess I don't understand this moment. I don't understand Moses having to convince God. I understand that God would have been completely justified in just destroying them all. You don't have to convince me of that. What I don't understand is that somehow Moses changed God's mind.
Well, and so, that always causes problems. And so, I'll jump to verse 14 right now. God repenting has often troubled people.
Repenting?
Right, that
you mean relenting?
The language is actually he repented.
Oh, mine says relented.
That's the more common way to smooth it out to make it easier to tolerate.
Oh.
But it's an anthropomorphism, right? It's giving God a human characteristic.
Okay.
And so it's revealing, I think, and this is I think the best way to understand it, is revealing God's response and grief. So the word repent here is a translation of the Hebrew word naham, meaning to be sorry, moved to pity, or have compassion. So he's sorry that he's done this because they don't actually want it. They don't actually want what he's offering. I think is the best way to understand it. And so this word is used 30 times in reference to God in the Old Testament. And in each case, he changes his mind or his intention. Is kind of the way that we would think about it. In accordance with his righteous purposes, and takes action in line with that purpose. So here's the thing, though. If God had destroyed all the rest of Israel and restarted with Moses, God could still have technically been keeping his promise to the patriarchs. Like, he wouldn't be violating that. Moses, I think, is just appealing for, as we should, for people who have fallen into sin and wrecked themselves, that God would not hold that against them, but would show compassion and mercy and bring them back in, restore them. And so I think that's kind of the appeal that Moses is making. And to be sure, God longs to do that, but God also is jealous. That is a Latin word used often of God, right? His jealousy, not in the sinful sense, but his jealousy is in part because of his love, right? So his jealousy functions to make sure that he's known properly, make sure that his love would be revealed to each other, his character would be revealed to others. And by their idolatry, that is being put into question. And we'll see that later when Moses comes back down. It says that they've made themselves, and essentially Yahweh, by their actions, into a laughing stock. And so, like, they're hindering God being made known, which is the same judgment that comes on Israel later and leads to their exile. Right? They have not been a reflection of God's character. And one of the indictments from the prophets is that the people of Israel are worse than the surrounding pagan nations. They're more ungodly.
I guess you don't have to convince me that, like, Israel was bad. I think the hard part for me is that when we as humans repent, we're turning from doing wrong. And God is incapable of doing wrong. So it feels weird that God could be acting rightly and then turn in the opposite direction and still be acting rightly. Like, I think that's something, like, I can't like fully comprehend. Like, I understand it in terms of, like, thinking about justice and mercy, and, like, God is always just, and when he chooses to be just and merciful, he does that by taking the justice on himself. So, like, I can understand, like, in that sense, God doing a 180, but still acting rightly, like, still being good. Like, it's just hard to picture someone changing their mind in such a way, and, like, one of those ways not being sinful.
Sure, I get that. And I think as we hear the next two of Moses' responses in the next coming chapters, it becomes more clear. And I think it shows that I know this is very intentional, because obviously it's God's word. It's pointing forward, in particular, to Christ being the perfect mediator through all of this. Like, it's going to point to how Christ does all these things and takes his place so that God can show compassion. Like, that's the thrust of all of this, is really these whole... You can't read chapter 32 without reading it in light of 33 and 34, which is the problem I think most people make. We don't read this story and this chapter in light of the next two chapters, which is really about God showing how he can be slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, punishing the iniquity of those who are wicked, and not ignoring it, and yet still showing compassion and mercy. Like, all of that goes hand in hand. And I think something in the covenant fundamentally changes in these three chapters. In chapters 32, 33, and 34, it goes from conditional to unconditional. Because all the stuff preceding this was conditional promises. If you do this, this is what you will get from me. It's kind of how Yahweh laid it out, how God laid it out with them. But by the end of 34, when they reiterate the covenant, there's no condition on the side of the people. It's only God's promise to continue to act for their blessing.
Sure.
Which is just...
Well, but God knows from the beginning they can't hold up their end of it.
Right. And so circling back to your point about that difficulty of thinking about repenting, I think for those, some of you have not been in Bible studies with us and talked with, and heard Mary Rose talk with us, but I think your own words actually help explain this. So when we talked about repenting, you've talked about how you can change from something bad to something else bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so God can change his mind, for lack of a better way of putting it, from something that is good and right and true to something that is good, right, and true in a different way. Without it being like, he can repent, but it not be turning in a sinful direction, but in a different, right, and faithful direction. And I think that's a good place to stop. And we will pick it up next week as Moses goes down the mountain.